in front of us. Leon, Luke Mendonça and Arjun Erigaisi both at half a point, both looking for their first win. I'm going to say this, I think it's an absolute must win.
Of course, on 3.5 at the moment, and Max, well, struggling a little bit in the tournament. He's on 1 point, and this is the position after rook e1 on move 11. So we have the c3 pawn hanging. I feel like that's the very first thing we have to call out here. White had options like a queen d3 or a queen f3, and has chosen to play rook e1 instead. So both c-pawns are hanging. Looks like no one's particularly concerned.
And it's really interesting. We're going to deep dive into knight takes pawn. It's the first question, but let's see how the players got here. We haven't checked in with the opening yet. Another French on the board, just as the one we saw in Hari's position, but a very different kind of French because this was the exchange variation where the center gets traded off, and it's often a very symmetrical opening development. Both sides are sort of mirroring each other. Black is mirroring white with the bishop coming out on its counterpart square. We see a trade, and then we see another trade. And here, instead of defending the c6 pawn, Pragg continues with copycat chess, bringing that knight in, attacking the c3 pawn. If white was to capture first, the queen would move forward, hitting the knight, and then eventually retaking the pawn on c3. Instead, Max decides to play rook to e1, and the first question has to be knight takes pawn, which attacks the queen. What does Max have in mind? And I think now your move of either going to d3 or to f3 to hit that knight, a more active square, queen f3, if you go back, knight to e4. And you know what? Here, yes, you can take on c6. It's really interesting.
Sure.
But there's something very tricky in the position. Notice how the knight and queen are attacking the pawn on f7. And you can make things very awkward for black after a move like bishop a3, hitting the defender on f8.
Could you play knight takes c6 and follow it up with bishop a3?
The problem with that might be that you go queen d6 and you control the... Actually, you don't control the a3 square, but you can just take on c6 in that case. So let me just show that. Knight takes pawn...
It doesn't quite work.
Yes, because now either queen d6 or queen d7 and you're hitting the knight. Yes, white would take the rook, but you've got enough material in that case.
Yeah, okay. Oh,
so knight takes pawn might be a big mistake, actually. So Pragg has to not be greedy in this position because bishop a3, the only move is knight d6, but this lands into big trouble. Notice how the d5 pawn falls as well. Knight e7 check, and you pick up, regain material with interest.
This is interesting as well. There are plenty of subtleties to consider, especially in the order in which these moves are played. And I'm sure there'll be some chess detractors that are saying, haha, I can't believe it, coming out of a super dead draw French exchange. Well, actually, there are plenty of things to consider even in that kind of position. I used to play the French exchange over the board because I didn't want to learn reams and reams of theory. And that actually works really well. It turns out when a player prepares for 15-20 moves of theory and you don't allow them to play it on move 3, they get really upset and make mistakes, which was a delightful weapon that I used for many years. But in this particular scenario, it's actually interesting to see how double-edged the position can be if a player not even makes a mistake. An inaccuracy in this position can cause it to turn really sharp really quickly.
Absolutely, and it almost feels like both players are sort of provoking the other to take on c3 or c6. Right now it's Pragg's move, and he could defend this pawn on c6 with a natural looking queen to d6, but apparently the bar does not like that move. And
wow.
There are ideas of the queen lined up against the rook, and I think there are tactics that you really need to be careful about. Check this out, John. f3, I think I have this figured out. f3 hits the knight, you're forced to fall back, because if you take knight takes pawn, suddenly the knight doesn't have any retreating squares. If you go to b5 to stop a3, a4 and the knight is trapped. And if you go knight a4, then there's bishop a3. It's not the most accurate move.
a dark squared bishop there.
And we have another result.
Oh, we do, yes. So Prag and Max have finished their game. What was the result there?
It's a draw. Prague, with the black pieces, holds this game. It started with that very symmetrical position. We were looking at those knights jumping around, pawns, double pawns on the c-file, and the balance was indeed maintained. Which means that Nodirbek joins Praggnanandhaa on the leaderboard right at the top.
So there we go. Nodirbek, an extremely dangerous